Livable. Queens, New York, no longer in Jamaica. Moved since the last time. This is In the Bin, the #1 source for news and views on argument, debate, rhetoric, oratory, all that good stuff. I'm Dr. Steve Yano. Welcome to the new In the Bin, which is live streamed, apparently. You can watch us on youtube.com/Steve Yano, on Twitch at twitch.tv/SophisticSteve, LinkedIn. You can just follow my profile on there. I think it's like LinkedIn. Just search for me, Steve Yano. And then, of course, if you can't catch the live stream or you're busy and you have to leave early, you can always get it on anchor.fm/inthebin, where our archive exists, and on Spotify now. So we have a great episode today with old friends. Joining us is the Canonical Debate Lab, and I'm joined by Timothy High, who is a software engineer and founder of Canonical Debate, and Bentley Davis from reasonpedia.com. Thank you guys for being on the show today. Great to have you. And you guys are the first live streamed In the Bin guests ever.
Fantastic. Great to be back.
Yeah, we've had you guys on the bin before, or in the bin before. Yeah. So it's good to have you here. And today we're talking about epistemic security, which I don't really have a good sense of what that is. So hopefully I'm going to learn something today from both of you. And we'll dive right into it. I'm going to make an assumption. I assume that when we're in a world where half of the Republican candidates from the midterm election believe that the election was stolen, and that they continue to shop that story around, even though there's no evidence that the election is stolen, that might be something that we're talking about in terms of epistemic security, but I'll let you guys define it, maybe. But that was my assumption.
Yeah, something like that. Let me start by saying I'm not an expert on the subject. It's a subject I've been studying lately as part of our work in the Canonical Debate Lab, which is studying debates and the importance of getting true information and trying to get the facts all organized. So as part of this, I started writing some articles. My first one is up right now about hybrid warfare, which is it's a term related to epistemic security, and it's a term that's more common going around these days. But let me define epistemic security as I understand it. In the academic field, and there was actually a conference, not everyone in the academic fields understand this term too. So it's one I'm trying to promote and get people to think about. But there was some conferences in the UK of people trying to study epistemic security, and they put out a really great paper that maybe we'll link to later. I didn't even get you the link, but I can give that to you. But epistemic security is related to epistemic processes. So they discuss how different communities or societies have epistemic processes. And one common epistemic process that we understand well is the scientific process, right? The scientific community has a process for how they come to accept things as fact, or how they believe things, right? Epistemology is the study of things we believe and why we believe them, right? So that being said, maybe some epistemic processes are better at getting the community to have more factful beliefs, fact-based beliefs, or what they call true beliefs. And some are worse at that. And there's also a question of, how long does it take for a community to come to a consensus over these things, and do they ever do that? So, that relates to the quality of an epistemic process. How good are they at getting to the facts and getting everybody on the same page in terms of those facts, right? So in the meantime, I think around the year 2000, they started getting into the military vernacular, what's known as PSYOPs. I mean, it's tactics that have been around forever, right? But PSYOPs is strategies, operations, organized around attacking the intelligence of an organization, right? Or, a nation, or whatever you're trying to attack. And so PSYOPs are different tactics for essentially disrupting the information systems of your target. Out of that comes these techniques of hybrid warfare and so on, and comes these tactics, these techniques. And the way it's been described in the community that discusses epistemic security is essentially these attacks are epistemic attacks. Things in a community's epistemic processes are known as that make it vulnerable to these kinds of attacks are known as epistemic vulnerabilities, right? And you can have what's called attack vectors, right? So essentially it's what are the different techniques that people use to disrupt the ability of a community to discern the truth, right? That's essentially, and so epistemic security is the opposite of that. What are the things you can do to protect yourself against that sort of thing? And I think you exactly hit on a major point, which is we live in a nation right now in which a very large percentage actually believes that the election was stolen 2 years after the election has ended, right? So, you know, it either was stolen or it wasn't stolen. The fact that we haven't come to a consensus on that 2 years after the fact shows there's certainly something wrong with our current epistemic process as a community.
All right. Yeah, very thorough, very interesting stuff. I had no idea about the connection with psyops. That's something we have to talk about a little bit more. Bentley, what do you have to add to that? What's your view of epistemic security?
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines, but also just to give some kind of other examples. Is several years ago, some operatives from Russia may have. I'm not saying government sanctioned, but were created a stirred up multiple groups to have protests on the same street in the same city at the same place at the same time, which isn't so much like beliefs, but it is stirring up our beliefs, and to get those people riled up enough, they're spreading misinformation. So also in knowing that those types of attacks are happening and being able to, and then having our epistemics and our social setups to where we're not always getting angry at the other side and othering people would kind of reduce the effect of those type of attacks from other countries. So that's kind of in the same bailiwick. I was wondering whether we could call it epistemic terrorism, where you're disrupting a community or a state by making the citizens believe two different things.
Right.
So yeah, that's a clickbaity title.
Yeah.
I love it.
I mean,
I like that
would,
kind
I
of
would,
stuff, as you know.
yeah, I might push back on the term epistemic terrorism because, I guess that maybe the definition of terrorism is acts that are intended to cause some kind of terror or panic that are meant to have an outsized impact in terms of the fear it causes in the witnesses of that act, right? And epistemic security and epistemic attacks, specifically under the framework of hybrid warfare, which is where I'm looking at this from mostly, is the exact opposite. Because one of the main features of hybrid warfare, because if you think about it, what is hybrid? Why is it hybrid? This is something I've been thinking about a lot. And one of the definitions for hybrid warfare is, it's not just war on the ground, boots on the ground, and weapons and actual killing. It's war, psychological warfare, war on all fields, right? So that's one definition of hybrid. But the other part of hybrid is really who is conducting this warfare, right? And one of the main features of hybrid warfare and epistemic attacks is the target does not necessarily know they are at war, nor that they are under attack.
Right.
Which is the exact opposite of terrorism, right? The point is you infiltrate and you do things that disrupt people's ability to discern what's going on to the point they don't even know where these are coming from, right? And if you think about Russian interference in U.S. elections and that sort of thing, the idea is not to let it known who is doing those kinds of attacks. And in fact, one part of it being hybrid is essentially at some point, you don't have to do anything. You just let it go. You create the division you can essentially feed different groups information that may or may not be true. And it's information catered to what they want to believe, and they will propagate it themselves. They'll even come up with new things, elaborate, and that sort of thing, kind of like, urban myths or whatever. It takes a life of its own, and you don't have to be the one that is doing the attacking, right?
Yeah, this sounds like I want to talk about the terrorism metaphor. That interests me because of some of the things I was thinking about in terms of traditional epistemic security, or the way we look at it from the humanities. But I think maybe we ought to explore the technical side first. And the question I have for both of you is about, this sounds like propaganda to me. So what are the differences between what's going on now and something like Tokyo Rose, or dropping leaflets from the plane the siege of Berlin and things like that? Like traditional kinds of, this is all technology too, using the radio to get that kind of interference and say, oh, you guys are all going to die if you come and do this. We're winning the war, etc. What's different now? I guess, the thing that Bentley was talking about is you had the investigation in the last election of how many fake Twitter accounts were run by Russian companies that purported to be different political parties or even state governments or county governments. So is it useful to think of epistemic security using those old metaphors of propaganda, or have we crossed into something that propaganda doesn't quite account for anymore? We're like beyond that kind of teaching.
I'd say that there's a mix of techniques, and some of them definitely fall under old propaganda. I think, like you mentioned, the propaganda gets easier these days. Like in the past, if you're dropping leaflets from a plane, they know the leaflets came from a plane, and so they kind of get a feeling of the source. Now, like radio, you could make it sound like you were broadcasting from the BBC, but really coming from Russia. So then you're able to seem like an authority. But now it's pretty easy to, at scale, seem like you're one of the other citizens in the community, which you would have to actually put spies on the ground to do that, which of course countries have done. So that sort of infiltrating or sleeper cell, except now they can do it from anywhere in the world and have hundreds of sleepers run by one person. So even though you can't, and you can also get information that way from talking. So it's this kind of, it's just that it's become easier to scale. But I would also call it propaganda. It's just, as the tools have changed, there's new capabilities and new scales.
What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, there's always been some kind of psychological warfare. The art of war is all about that. It's nothing new, and we've never had reliable epistemic processes, right? The scientific revolution was a revolution because it might have been the first time where knowledge was meant to be built upon in a formal, structured way, built on actual physical evidence and that sort of thing, right? So it's been around forever. This is just a new framing of it, and it's a formalization and I would say, professionalization of it to some degree. The fact that it showed up in military manuals in the Department of Defense as psyops and that sort of thing. You have people who are actively focusing as their entire job on the kind of propaganda that is more subtle, it infiltrates more, and it uses, it's a formal study of the techniques available and the technologies available, and studying what works and what doesn't work. So I would say essentially it's a more mature evolution of what's always been around.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I just think about it from my perspective as a teacher and somebody who teaches propaganda and things like that. Sometimes we might be creating a false sense of security. So when we teach these kind of old ways of determining, it's sort of like the same problem when you're teaching the fallacies. You teach a certain way of identifying them. Well, then people get this kind of overwrought sense of self-confidence. And so then they think, oh, well, then I can easily trust my judgment when I'm analyzing information on Facebook or analyzing information on the internet. But then I think back to when I was in college in the 90s and how my parents would regularly send me these warnings about from police officers about things people were doing that were in like Comic Sans font, and they had all these technical elements to them that I could easily recognize as being a fake document or bad information. But that was lost on somebody from a generation where this technology is very impressive. So I guess where I'd like to go now is what technological things are we doing or do we have that can help run interference on this stuff? It's probably not enough because of the way it's going to just say, well, we can rely on the youth or we can rely on people being familiar with this stuff to know what's fake and what's not. That doesn't seem to really work the way it did with the email chains. So what kind
Yeah,
of technical things do we have? What technology do we have to help us?
I know Tim has a lot of answers to that on from his blog post, but let me dive in on a few. Um, interesting that you mentioned that trying to teach this can be a problem. It's where people get kind of overconfident, and it's kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where they know a little bit and but their confidence is outsized. So I think an important thing is also teaching that in a lot of these propaganda situations, sometimes and in falling for fallacies or misinterpreting them, a lot of times the people who are more knowledgeable tend to fall for them more. Con men almost often actually focus on very intellectual people. People seem intellectual because they're overconfident in their ability to spot con people that perform cons. So they tend to be a pretty good mark. So teaching that a little bit, saying that even studies show that even if you know the stuff is going on, you are still um, uh, subject to it, and you have to double think on every kind of situation that comes for you, comes that you see. And then we're working, as we teach people. This may be the wrong term, Steve. I've heard you talk about critical thinking and stuff, but you know, as we can kind of teach um, people to think critically and then have resources that they can go to see how the community has put in all the knowledge into a single place, which is kind of the Canonical Debate Lab idea as being one of the tools for this. It doesn't cover all of the situations, but it can help.
Did you want to
Yeah,
chime in there, Tim? Yeah, go ahead.
I could go on. I could go on for hours just to answer this one question, but I'll try to make it brief.
Yeah, go
To
ahead.
start with, yeah. To start with, the canonical debate, which is what our group is working on, I am proposing as an extremely valuable tool or solution for epistemic security. It's not a silver bullet, but it would have, I believe, a major impact on improving epistemic security. But the question is, well, first of all, going back, what's going on with epistemic security these days? And in the academic papers I've read so far, there seems to be a consensus in terms of the accelerated danger, the amplified danger that social media and other modern technology poses, because as you said, over history, over time, Tokyo Rose and so on, you had ways of infiltrating and doing some sort of propaganda and changing minds, but they were all a lot slower and a lot shorter reach in general, or you had to get to the key person, right? You had to get to the New York Times. You had to get to the advisor to the king or something like that, right? And these days, anyone who has the right techniques and strategies can amplify their voice and a lot quicker. So there are amplified dangers due to technology, right? And as a side note that I won't go into right now, democracies are especially at risk to this sort of thing, as we're kind of seeing. But we can talk more about that later. As for techniques that can help us, teaching people how to think critically is a major step that can be done. It's not, none of these are going to be the full answer, but in a more formal sense, what people who study epistemic security have been doing is studying exactly, breaking down specific threats and specific interventions, right? and trying to pair them up. And so, like, one example I can give is what's known as gatekeeping, right? So you have sort of a vulnerability, which is the quick ability for somebody to spread misinformation, right? Given the internet right now. No, 1 second.
That's okay. Yeah, epistemic security in real life.
Sorry.
There was an intervention right there. Someone was that the
I
government
was getting
coming to shut
exactly.
you
They're
down?
coming for me.
Yeah, it
No.
happens to me every day. I get it.
But yeah, so right. So it's easy for people to spread information. So what we used to have is a strong kind of gatekeeping, right? And gatekeeping is a kind of intervention, which means you have somebody with stronger, higher privileges verifying, validating information, and deciding what gets passed on. So that could be a newspaper, that can be a publisher. That's how it was historically, right? You know, Walter Cronkite, whatever. Somebody trusted who's going to send on the information. These days we have less gatekeeping. So one intervention could be introduce more gatekeeping, right? Like Twitter can do by removing accounts that it thinks is spreading misinformation as a kind of gatekeeping. Now, the problem with that, or censorship is another way of looking at it. The problem with that, and this is what they study, is you have an intervention and they study how that would reduce the damage or the risk of that vulnerability, right? So gatekeeping would slow down the spread of misinformation. But they also study the side effects, which is that it leads to distrust, it leads to censorship, it leads to accusations of malpractice, of bad intentions, and it can actually strengthen extremist groups that are trying to tell you that the elite or whoever has it out against you, right? It essentially leads to higher polarization. So, you know, what's really interesting is, you know, there are tons of different things that can be done, interventions that can be done to help, and each one of them has its negative consequences as well as its positive consequences.
Yeah, very good. It makes me think there's a lot I want to pursue there, including the democracy point. I'm still also thinking about the terrorism point. I'm not sure where to go on all this. This is very rich. But when we think about the gatekeeping model, so the big problem with that, I think back to like the Hearst newspapers, and I think back to yellow journalism and muckraking and the motive of always wanting to circulate more of whatever the thing is that you're investing in to gatekeep. You want people to pay you for because you're putting all this into. And so you have that problem with it too. And journalism is kind of a form of censorship. If you think of it from journalistic ethics, they're looking at a story that has a particular kind of standard, but that standard is done kind of ethically. And I wonder what you guys would think about something. This is just something that came on the top of my head is, would it be okay or ethical for Google? I think Chrome is still the most used browser. I don't know the up-to-date stats, but I think more people use Chrome than probably any other browser. Maybe Safari. I don't know about Mac users. But would it be ethical for Google to put a tool or force a tool in there that would pop up and say, hey, you know, this website's information has not been checked or is skeptical. We're skeptical about the nature of this information. I mean, again, you get the immediate idea that Google would preference people who are hiring them as their advertising or paying for their advertising, but they probably wouldn't be so crass. But I wonder if that would be something that would be like a gatekeeping option and how we would feel about something like that. Would that be ethical to mandate in there? Is something you can't turn off? I know somebody would eventually engineer an ad blocker or something, but there's no stopping the coders. But I wonder if something like that would be a good stopgap. It certainly wouldn't replace critical thinking, but I wonder what you guys would think of that.
Yeah, so it's an interesting idea, and also that same idea with both opt-in or mandatory. And to your point, yeah, and to Tim's talking about gatekeepers, and that's kind of like, we have fewer gatekeepers, and also gatekeepers that whose incentives are kind of even worse aligned with our goals than they have ever been. Well, not ever. Let's not say ever, but it seems more recently with the focus on advertising and stuff that that the more the gatekeepers rile us up, the more money they make. So they're incentivized to break down our democracy, actually. Yeah, so having it, having it opt-in and having it mandatory, but I think having that resource, at least as an opt-in and being publicized, would be helpful. It'd be interesting, like when you're installing a browser or first starting up and logging in, it offers you that capability. But then we also have the other problem of who keeps the gatekeepers, right?
Right.
How do you determine what is true and what is not? The Canonical Debate Lab so far has kind of a theory of saying we want all the information to be available. So its database doesn't kind of pick sides. In Reasonpedia, the system is designed to pick sides, but the sides can change over time as more information is added. So at no one time can you really kind of look at it and say, oh, this is the answer. So I hadn't even really thought about then if we did have something that kind of was exposing this epistemic knowledge that we store in the Canonical Debate Lab and Reasonpedia and similar systems, is that how can we expose that in a way that it's useful, that it's not overwhelming, and that all sides of the current debates would find it, not that everyone, but a majority of the people on both sides of the debate would find it helpful and not feel like they are just being silenced, or that their side is being try to not feed into the conspiracy theories that a certain ideology is being limited.
Yeah, I wonder how you'd stop the spillover of the media. Though the media is biased, but both sides say that these days, which is kind of funny. And then you think, immediately I thought about Google. I'm like, oh yeah, that would be good to put in the browser. But then what you're saying is like, there might not even be conspiracy here. You remember Google fired their chief AI ethics researcher because they didn't like a paper she wrote because it harmed their bottom line, is the way I read that. Now, I don't know if that's the true story, but that's the way I read it. But yeah, what do you think, Tim? Or Billy, you can follow up on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Once again, a lot of things. So you're talking about a specific intervention, right? Would it be ethical? I'm not an expert on ethics, but I think it would be ethical for them because they're doing it for the right reasons. Would it be a good idea? I don't think necessarily. And that's where you got to look at the trade-offs in terms of the intervention versus the side effects, the third, second order, third order consequences. And it would immediately, once again, increase the distrust in Google overall, right? Already the big tech companies are under fire for manipulation of information and that sort of thing. So I would not do it if I were them. It begs a larger question, which is, how do you guarantee to people that information is good and that you're being honest about providing this information, especially as a gatekeeper? How can they trust you? And by the way, in terms of the papers I've read about epistemic security, they break it down into essentially 4 different pieces or categories of epistemic vulnerabilities. One of those is trust. Undermining trust is a major epistemic vulnerability. And so you have fact-checking. Fact-checking works to some degree, studies have shown, but in general has been a failure. And part of that is because you can undermine the trust of the fact-checkers, right? What is it, Snopes, that got donations from Soros or one of his foundations or something, and because of that, nobody who trusts the less, nobody who distrusts the less will ever trust Snopes. It becomes a joke to them if you show them a fact check from Snopes, right? Because they're controlled by George Soros, right? So how do you fix or bring back trust, right? And I think the answer to that is laying bare your epistemic process and showing that you have a healthy epistemic process. And a healthy epistemic process is one which allows contribution from anyone, one which permits criticism in a healthy way, which shows it has an open process for vetting information. And the more it eliminates biases from the process, the more you can trust that epistemic process, which is why the scientific method is always held up as one
That's
of the
what I was
better
going to
ones we
say.
have.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As a process, it's
Mhm.
fantastic. If people are following the process and if it's working, then it's maybe the best one we have at this point. But there are a lot of questions in terms of the implementation these days.
Sure.
But that's what the canonical debate, I think, shines at. It's what we have designed really well, is to eliminate bias, allow all voices, try to eliminate the problems of too much information, right? By essentially deduplicating things. That's why it's called canonical. Is one of the forms of epistemic attack is to attack your ability to absorb information, cognitive overload, what we call the attention economy, that sort of thing. This is why do your own research doesn't work, is because nobody has time to do all the research themselves, right? So that is an epistemic vulnerability. So what we designed is something that can, take all the repeated information and collapse it down into one thing. So it gets to the essence very quickly and saves you the time, but allows all sides in. And in that sense, by being fully transparent, hopefully maintains the trust and shows that we aren't being biased in anything. In fact, the canonical debate doesn't decide what is true. It lets you decide what is true based on all the information, which eliminates the bias of, oh, no, they're controlled by whoever. That's why they say this is the truth, right? We don't say what is the truth.
Right. I think that's probably one of the more interesting things about it, is when you're thinking about what those standards would be and making those open standards for your process, your epistemic process, like showing your work. Like, you remember math class, right? That's a good metaphor. It's like, I don't care if you got it right. I want to see if you did it based on the standards of good mathematics practice. Or like science lab. But then you get into the issue of whether or not these things that we're deciding are best thought of from a scientific or a logical perspective. There are emotions at play and things like that. So I like this idea of open source as a way of saying, well, here are the elements that I think are in there. Maybe we're thinking of sharing it like a GitHub version of the scientific method. Let me show you my code, and maybe you can improve the code as long as you give me credit, or as long as you don't change some elements of it. This is sort of like a Creative Commons license for thinking.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to do in Reasonpedia, is you list all of your reasons for and against your kind of main point in the article. And each reason you have can have the other reasons on why you think that's a good reason. And to your point of emotions, those can be brought in as emotions is a form of information, right? So you would say, people are feeling this way, or I'm feeling this way. And people can look at your base assumptions and decide whether or not they agree with it. And then, like in the Canonical Debate Lab, it's kind of deduped. So the idea is that you would then have a tree of logic, what we kind of call an argument tree, that would kind of be all your reasons in a way that's easy to understand. Reasonpedia is just a kind of an example of that, but the idea is that the underlying math and technology that you use to weigh up your reasons, and that is mathematically I would kind of want to say that anyone can get in there and look at the math and kind of follow it. It doesn't mean it's true just because it comes up with a score, but at least you know how they got to it. So it is a way of showing your work, and it's more than just saying, oh, I believe this, and this. It's like, well, how much do you believe each one of those, and why? And have that go down as deep as they want to go, and then you can say, well, you didn't go deep enough here, or you can say, oh, yeah, I didn't think of some of those reasons. So yeah, this Reasonpedia in a way is really kind of a way of showing your work. And it's interesting because you go to any news site and very few of them cite kind of where their sources. And the ones that do, they really only cite the sources that they accepted. They don't list the sources that they didn't accept. And even in a lot of meta papers, they say, okay, we're going to look at all the studies that have random controlled trials and have this. But oftentimes they don't list, well, these are all the studies that we're aware of that fall out of that bucket. So then when I'm looking at a study, it's like, well, was this included in your analysis or not? And if it wasn't, was it because it didn't fit, or is it because you just missed it?
Mhm.
So yeah, having that, I think it would be interesting to have that backup. And then I had another thought about Steve's suggestion about a um, kind of a browser plugin or something. It'd be
Mhm.
interesting if, and this is probably too much to do, but if it's like, okay, this article that you're reading is kind of biased. It's only showing this side of the argument, and here are all the counter arguments to all that. Now, I feel that might be a bit overwhelming without some sort of scoring system, so it may not be helpful, but it's just an interesting kind of thought to play around with when we're trying to figure out how to help us out. And I guess another point for the conversation, if we want to talk about, is epistemic inoculation, right? So
Mm.
if you hear the rebuttal before you're exposed to the bad information, you're less likely to believe the bad information. So having news organizations kind of preempting uh, misinformation was coming out. Of course, we were just talking about we don't have a good definition for misinformation, but
That's right. Yeah, nobody really. Everybody seems to,
yeah,
but nobody does.
yeah,
That's what it feels like to me. But anyway, sorry. Finish your thought. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt
yeah.
you.
No, that's
Good stuff you're
basically
saying.
it. So those are some of the
Yeah.
points that we can continue kind of chatting about.
I'll just toss in here a mention of Public Editor, which is it's not exactly a partner project of Canonical Debate, but we're in touch with the head of that project, which does more or less what you're talking about. They have an epistemic process. They have a process they've defined in which they rate news articles for bias and for factfulness, right? So they've defined a process where it's independent of any individual to go through a news article, rate sentences based essentially on how heavy the rhetoric is as opposed to just telling the facts, how biased it seems to be, and any other fact check issues that were shown up. And so they essentially, it's not rating a news source like CNN or Fox News. They rate each individual article that way. And then they have a process where then other people review the reviews. So they have, they have quality control on that sort of thing. And so they essentially try to annotate articles and rate them on how unbiased and so forth they are.
That's super interesting. All of these tools seem really interesting, but they're all kind of like, I don't know. I kind of think the teaching of critical thinking is essential here. Especially, well, we have a lot of fact checkers, but we don't really have faith checkers, and it feels like a lot of times we teach people that the truth feels really good, and it's shameful to admit that you're wrong. So I was thinking about these things as part of the epistemic process, is that when we admit we're wrong, we do it in the same way as if we have committed a bad act. I wonder if there's a way we could find a pedagogy to teach people that being wrong is a point of pride because it means you went out and looked at other information. So fact checking seems like
Or
maybe
at
a
least,
quarter of it. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, at least changing your mind
Yeah.
and saying why you changed your mind is something that should be a badge of honor to show
Yeah.
you are a person who actually analyzes information and is open to that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
that doesn't work in politics for.
Sure, right. I just think there's no taste for it. I think we really like the kind of, somebody earlier, I can't remember who it was, talked about, well, it's not a silver bullet, but I think it might have been you, Tim, talking about some of the tools out there. It's not a silver bullet, but, and I was like, well, thank God. Like, I think we need to get away from this idea of silver bullet. Like, I have the truth, and it could be a badge of honor for a politician on the campaign trail to be like, oh, I was wrong. And I found this. Isn't this great? Think back, there's an example of this from the Lincoln Douglas debates I think I've talked about before, where Lincoln was asked a question by Stephen Douglas. And it's like, 30 minutes for the question, 3 hours for the response, an hour and a half for the rebuttal. Nobody would tolerate this format today, even if it was on Disney+. I think that Lincoln said, well, I have an answer in mind, but I want to check the facts. So let's adjourn. I'm going to go to the library for about an hour and do some research, and I'll come back. Everybody thought this was perfectly reasonable to do. But I think if you saw a candidate do that today, people would be like, what a loser. So we have a huge wall of this kind of like, I want to call it faith checking, as well as fact checking. Maybe that needs to be in there too. We have a comment from the chat. This comes to us from Twitch. You can, of course, if you're watching somewhere else, you can join the conversation on Twitch, twitch.tv/SophisticSteve. This is from Not Tribute. What happens when those established news organizations are themselves arbiters of bad and biased information? That is tough to solve for because you're basically granting authority where it might otherwise be undue. Who wants to tackle this one? I think it's a good question to chat about. You want to do it, Bentley?
Yeah. So that's definitely an issue, and it's an issue that's been around for a long time. And now that everyone's their own kind of broadcaster, then the question is, what is kind of a news organization? So I don't think we're promoting that news organizations should be authority. They should be stating their information and showing the work. So in this case, actually, we're not even asking, like we were talking about trust earlier. We're kind of reducing the need for trust. If people are showing their work, then you can inspect it at any time, and then if that work can be, added to by other people or discussed by other people, then authority becomes something that's less necessary.
I could add to that too, from the perspective of epistemic security, trust is necessary, but is, in their analysis, creates that second order negative effect or risk. The more you trust something, the more damage that can be done when that trust is broken, right? An excellent example of this is, the problem of deep fakes and falsified information, that sort of thing. There's a proposal to solve the problem by registering media on the blockchain, or registering provenance, so that if something is original, by immediately getting it on the blockchain with a hash code and everything, mathematically proving that was the original, it hasn't been altered in any way, and that sort of thing, which is fantastic. And done right, it can solve this problem in a major way. But if it solves it so well that there's no reason to question it, it's mathematically provable, it's right there. What happens when somebody figures out a way to hack and actually put in some fake information? The more you trust something, the more you're likely to trust a piece of misinformation that comes out of that trusted source, right?
Yeah.
So that's the danger. Like Bentley said, the goal is to, instead of having to trust, reduce the need to trust, right? I think that was very well put. In the case of the news articles, what this other group is doing is they're analyzing it article by article rather than by news source, as a whole. So you don't just trust the source because, how do you trust the source? Hopefully you trust the source because they have a good epistemic process, right? They show their work and that sort of thing. But even then, you should be able to break down article by article and not just take it on their word that it's true. Right?
Yeah, it'd be nice to kind of bring in some scientific principles in here, and maybe better than it's been implemented today, because our science, the replicatability crisis. But to have a
there's a whole other episode there.
right. To have kind of an expected peer review article process. Like, I'm not even going to read an article from the New York Times till I know someone from Fox News has vetted it. Right, or has looked at it and given their feedback, right?
That's
so
funny.
It doesn't even pop up until 2 or 3 organizations, and maybe it should be CNBC and Fox News. So to where I don't even see it until they've hashed back and forth a couple times, so we get peer review for news.
Yeah, I think Fox News viewers think it's Fox News versus the world, right? It's like Scott Pilgrim versus the world kind of thing, like the hero. I mean, for me, my response to it as a rhetorician is people take a lot of pride in their news sources, right? People are proud to be a New York Times or New Yorker subscriber. So what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? Because people will be proud to be a reader of the scientifically vetted site as well. And they'll share, they'll be like, that comes with it. So I don't know if you can, if we can technically eliminate this idea of trust, but we certainly could be more open about it and say, look, when you trust something, it's because you're identifying with it on a very deep level about who you think you are and who you wish you were. Be aware of that. Be aware of that. This is one of the things that makes, I think, debate such a powerful low resolution tool to stuff like this, bad and biased information, because in a debate, like just a very simple kind of face-to-face, or even in a forum like this, where we're doing like a stream, a debate is a very low resolution epistemic security tool where people say, well, what about this? Or what about, they bring up something old, like, oh, you like the New York Times? What about Jason Blair? How are they checking back for that? Are you aware of that situation from years ago? And these things come up because of that idea to try to poke holes in that idea of, I don't like this. I feel distrustful of this. I think this is bad in my heart kind of feeling. So as a rhetorician, I think of all that stuff. And I wonder, I think fact check is good. I'm not opposed to fact check, but I feel like there has to be a lot more than that. And we can't boil off or reduce those kind of human feelings. So that's what I would respond to. This is like, I think people will find that authority. And then if we do like we were talking about earlier, show your work. Well, the reason I like them is because I like them. I really like the way, like, you're not going to, this is what I tell people. Like I was thinking about doing in the pin episode, because Thanksgiving is coming up, how to deal with your Fox News relatives, which is a very, very, very close to home topic for me. I'm never going to be able to compete. This looks nice. I mean, I think I'm doing a pretty good job with this streaming thing. I'm never going to be able to compete with Fox News because they've got the chiseled jaw, the beautiful eyes, the $4,000 suit, the $10,000 studio lighting, the 8K cam with the perfect lens. You can't wish these things away.
An interesting thing when you're talking about identity, that is true. That's a natural thing to identify with your news sources, and also as you've been sharing those on social media, you get more and more invested because now
That's
if
right.
you find out they do something wrong, what you've been spreading misinformation for the last couple months.
Yeah, you feel like you're a part of that media company. You feel like you're like, oh, I really am. To use Kenneth Burke's term, I'm consubstantial with them. Our motives are aligned. I'm trying to do the good work of Sean Hannity or whoever you like.
Yeah, and an interesting thing is I think I can't remember where I heard about the study, but they were working on some communities. Rather than identifying with community, you identify with your epistemic skills. So in a scientific community, you gain social points, and your identity is more focused on, whether you fact check and peer reviewed and had random control trials. So it's interesting that your identity could be focused on a methodology rather than a specific authority.
Yeah,
So
I
it'd
think
be
that's
interesting to build that as a point of identity and pride.
I think that's what. So Not Tribute offered the follow-up comment. We're talking about, well, it's often what they're not reporting on. Maybe that would be something that could be like, what's our standard for newsworthiness? And be more upfront with that.
Yeah,
like, why do we choose to cover a story, not another one? Occasionally, journalistic outlets will say why they choose to cover a story and not another one. The New York Times has a page on that, I think.
Although now that
the BBC does too.
Yeah. And they do have, I mean, news organizations do have a amount of sway, and like you were saying, Fox News and large organizations that have a lot of media presence and stuff. But honestly, there's so many ways to get information out there that I don't think the fact that the large organizations on all sides aren't reporting a story isn't something that's keeping it from being out there. There's lots of independent journalists or people that are trying to get information out, spread on social media, and things go viral. I mean, it'd be nice if we could have news organizations comment on everything, but they do have to decide where they're going to put their resources. But now that anyone can, we're streaming on here. So now that anyone can do it, it's less of an issue than it would have been in the past.
Yeah.
You don't. What you don't get though is you get each news outlet kind of reporting stories that are good for their side.
Yes.
And you don't get the other news outlet rebutting that by saying no. That you're not going to get a headliner that says no, that report isn't actually all that important, right? That thing they said isn't actually all that true or whatever. So you don't get a full debate between the news sides, which are trying to trying to argue for their side, basically.
Right.
This is another one of those big categories of epistemic vulnerabilities, which is group identity, tribalism, right? That sort of
Sure.
thing,
Yep.
and also isolation, group isolation, enclosed groups that don't allow other kinds of information in. There's debates I've read, other studies that show there's not as much of a filter bubble as one would think, but there are other techniques that create the same effect, whether or not, essentially instead of the information not arriving, they get the information arriving at a form that's already kind of disinfected and massaged to be palatable for their side of the argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Group affirming
Mm-hmm.
information, right?
Yeah, and the speed at which that you have to compete now. Like, how many times a day is the New York Times updated? How many times a day is Fox News website updated? There's like a real pressure on journalistic ethics to fight the need of, like, well, we have to circulate this important information, but how do we communicate that the story is imperfect? And if you go back, retractions are never looked at as much as headlines, or corrections are never looked as like that. I like following this Twitter called what is Updating the Gray Lady, and they show every headline and change and every change to the New York Times through the day, and they show you what was taken out. Kind of like when you're doing a Google shared doc with somebody and they take something out, it like tracks the changes. And that's kind of interesting to see how they'll change the phrasing on political headlines here and there, and you can kind of guess what their motives are for doing that. But I think any journalist would be both concerned about this idea of tribalism. Obviously, they don't want that. They're trying to give the story for everybody in a way they use. But I also think journalists are very, very, very hesitant about debate. And they say, well, if a story is debatable, that means it's not true, right? That kind of oversimplistic view of debating. So we would only debate something if it was indeterminate. But this is the facts, and these are the interviews, and this is what Governor DeSantis said, or whoever. So I wonder if maybe the correct role for these things are sources for us to say, well, I'm not going to trust any of those, but I am going to debate you on it. And debate is a point of pride. It doesn't mean that I am questioning what I believe in. People see that as a problem. Like, no, these are the facts. These can't be to question these is to erode democracy itself. So how do we get that into our teaching in terms, and also we're dealing with adult learners here too, people in their 40s, 50s, like myself. Those things are ingrained at a young age as points of pride, like good work, or you're such a good student, or you're so smart. Like, it's deeply connected with these emotional valences, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm thinking about, oh gosh, I guess I just blanked out. I had so many comments coming up that my brain just froze.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah.
It's a miracle I can get anything out these days, I think.
Yeah. No, I guess I completely lost it. Tim, you got it.
Well, yeah, I don't have a reaction to that specific thing. I mean, it's yeah. My main reaction is something that, it's related to the canonical debate, is more trying to visualize how this would look, all of this. Just imagine if there were an actual fact database somewhere that I had the truth about everything, right?
Man, when I was a kid, there was this thing. It was called Encyclopedia Britannica, and it was in the library. Simpler times.
No, I'm talking about like a real. Imagine if there were a real actual. Yeah, I'm not.
This is what I thought about that. It's just funny.
Yeah. But an actual unimpeachable source of that sort of thing. Canonical debate would not be that, but it would be as close as maybe we could humanly get, right? And you were talking about granularity. It's the most fine-grained thing possible, because every sentence almost in a news article is some kind of claim, right?
That's right.
And so what would it look like? What would news articles look like? What would political speeches look like? What would things look like if there actually existed that database of really fine-grained facts, and everybody who's writing a news article or who's writing a political speech or writing a book, whatever, knew they're writing it in a world where the facts are actually already there, or they're out there? How careful would you be? How would you structure your news article? How would you structure what you're writing, knowing that everything you're writing is going to be vetted, and people could link to that thing you said and say, "Oh no, that's not true. Oh no, well that that doesn't make any sense." So now, how does that impact writing?
I wonder if journalists I should probably see if I can get a journalist on here, because I kind of feel like you're describing their current nightmare situation. I think this is what keeps them up at night. I think they feel like they're in that world in a way, not maybe as science fictiony as your,
Well,
Asimov level.
I mean, what your statement before was that they like stating things as fact,
Yes.
and they like getting to facts. I would say
Yes.
journalists really like to have the facts, right?
Mhm.
So it shouldn't be their nightmare. Their nightmare would be people proposing or arguing that their facts are false, right? People
Right.
proposing alternative facts and that sort of thing. But if they knew that what they were writing was going to be shown as factful, and they could be the most factual writer out there, that might be a good thing for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gives them both it gives them an automatic defense as well, because if they check that source, the kind of the community fact base, which would be the Canonical Debate Lab, and maybe even link to it, then they know they can shut down a lot of those conversations where people are come in and start challenging the base assumptions of the article that is really kind of settled by most people, or could be settled in this potential future situation. We're not there yet. So yeah, having kind of a base of facts, and then we can discuss the conclusions that are coming off those facts, or the new facts that are introduced. But oftentimes an article comes out and we're not only rehashing the new facts, we're rehashing all the old facts, all the way down the line, and it's just overwhelming, and then people give up.
Yeah. I think there's like a balance between the responsibility of cluing the readers into what's been covered already and where the story's coming from, and then serving those deeper readers. Like for me, I always really prefer the news stories in like the London Review of Books, because they assume you've read all those day-to-day stories, and then they're going way, way, way deep. But that's not for everybody. But it's also a preference. So when we think about fact, we can think of a working definition as all the information that's situationally relevant and vetted for this issue. And then that's always a moving sphere, isn't it? That's always a moving boundary, because as the issue changes, then other things become more relevant. As information becomes more relevant, we might call it a fact. So it's kind of a moving ball. So what you're really proposing here, what canonical debate really seems to be doing, is operating in a different mode of thinking than we usually do when we think of linear processed information, or information processed in non-fungible text. I receive a newspaper twice a day. We're still kind of teaching that, aren't we? We're still kind of teaching. I bet if I Googled right now argumentation syllabi in my field for the argumentation course, one of the assignments would be letter to an editor. I can't think of anything more irrelevant for teaching people how to argue than that assignment. But come for me out there, rhetoricians, if you want to. But what would be, it also reminds me of an anecdotal story of my younger sister. When she was in college, she wasn't sure how to do Chicago citation. And I happened to be at her place for the holiday, for Thanksgiving or whatever. I was like, oh, here's how you do it. Here's how you do Chicago, da-da-da. And she was trying to figure out how, because she was citing the same article many times in her paper, like undergraduates do. They'll cite like 4 things, and they cite them like a bunch of times because they don't want to get dinged for plagiarism. She was trying to figure out how to make it hyperlink. So she's like, why do I have to retype that site again? And that really kind of blew my mind. So what we're really thinking is an entirely different way of consuming relevant information, aka news. A whole different literacy is, I think, what you're suggesting, which kind of blows my mind a little bit.
Yeah, and as we're going through this, you don't really, it becomes amazing on how fragile we realize our current epistemic process and our human brains are. So one of the great things about this kind of making information grow and over time and deduplication is that you're actually distributing your wisdom and intelligence among multiple people. Because Tim could fill out one part of the graph of knowledge, and I could fill out another part, and then we could have 2 people review our work. But that means not one of us had to find all the facts and all the information, and we're trusting that many eyes, kind of help the situation.
Right. Yeah. This is sort of like, I always talk about on this show, Mercier and Sperber's book, the enigma of reason. What is reason? Is it best described as an evolutionary thing for people, or what? And how they're always talking about how the best way to think about it is we created reason as communicative creatures in groups. And maybe the issue is that most of the time now we're evaluating information solo. We're not doing it with other people. We're doing it on a screen with the illusion of other people, typing rather rude comments sometimes, and providing links. And like the phrase, do your own research, I think, only tracks. We could do the Enneagram or whatever it's called. Only tracks along with Facebook becoming less a place to share dog pictures and more a place to share election fraud stories and politics, which is mostly what Facebook is for me these days. I wonder if there's a place to say that what we need is more in-person group conversation. A low-tech solution to this as part of our epistemic security is facing your opponent in the flesh and saying you're wrong changes things. It really changes things in a very tangible way.
So on that point, I'm not sure. I think we've mentioned some of these groups in the past, Steve, but I'm not sure how many you're familiar with. But there's like the Listen First Project, which helps people kind of listen to their side. There's Braver Angels that brings together Republicans and Democrats to have more discussions than debates. There's Living Room Conversations. So there are a couple groups kind of working on that. My concern, and I think Tim's concern, is that those are kind of ephemeral, and each person has to learn. It's a very it's very time consuming, and so we're hoping to convert all of that into also kind of a written form, so you consume it a little bit more quickly and at the level of depth that you feel is necessary. But there's a lot of great projects that I think we that are worth looking into, and we probably need to make a list of those for people viewing to so that they can explore that. But those are some great projects.
Yeah, I think so. I'm familiar with Braver Angels. I talked to them a couple times. They wanted to do something at my university. I never really got back to them, so much for interaction, communicative failure. And then listening to, I think the time investment here is huge. The time investment is huge. And I always tell my students, they say, wow, it takes a long time to argue and debate and do it right. To do it in a epistemically, I guess when I say do it right, I mean an epistemically valid way or an epistemically defensible way, where you're listening, you're following up, you're researching, things like that. And I always say, well, whose interest is it to have you not have any time for this? Who benefits from not having the time to look deeply into claims and deeply into counter arguments? Who's benefiting from that? Who's benefiting from like, oh, I gotta go to work? Is it democracy? Is it somebody else? Yeah, right. The epistemic, or just the capitalist who says, actually, I'm in favor of not to name names, but I'm in favor of a digital town square, and it's so important. I want to own it. But also PayPal.
Right. Not to name names.
Right.
One thing I would definitely say, in the name of debate in general, is it breaks down one of those epistemic vulnerabilities we talked about, which is isolation, tribalism, and that sort of thing, because putting people in contact with one another forces them to interact with the ideas on the other side. On the other side of that, we have a major epistemic strategy or hybrid warfare strategy, right? Which is populism. We could call it populism. Doesn't have to be traditional populism, but populism as a strategy in general, political strategy, is to create divides, right? It's to kind of give simplistic explanations for everything, associate all problems in the life of your group with the other. You essentially make the other side the other, you demonize them, you blame everything on them, and you create a very simplistic divide that gives you a good hold on your half of that people pie or whatever. But it's a major epistemic strategy, and it's a way you can create warfare. It's a way you can win elections for sure. It's a way, if you're on the outside wanting to break apart a target, your strategy is to try to create a division within them by defining two sides and making them hate each other, right? And debate if you're going one-on-one and meeting with people in person, you're breaking down that sense of the other by humanizing people once again. And so, I think that's a very important intervention or strategy.
Yeah, I think having a person in front of you is important and useful. I wonder also think though that kind of like Steve, like you mentioned earlier, that having time to go back and do some research, and having time also in the middle of the between conversations to rethink your position and really mull over what the other person said. I find oftentimes I'll have a big argument with someone and then find out a month later that they've actually changed their mind somewhere in the process. And of course, they didn't bother telling me.
Yeah, of course not. Yeah, why would they? Yeah.
And whether I was part of that or not. And then I
Yeah.
find myself later on the next couple of days after like feeling like I trounced someone, that I'm like, oh, well, maybe, maybe they made a few good points there. Maybe I should look that up. So having this space in between, but also an interesting thing about doing it in kind of a technologically or written way as opposed to in person, is that you can hear the reasoning and the logic from the best spoken. So if you get 20 people that think of something different than you, and they all come together and work on the best phrasing of their side of the argument, then you can dive into it much quicker and think about it on your own in a much slower process, and not have the added pressure of being in public or thinking about what's happening in that other person's brain while I'm formulating my response. I mean, you should be thinking about them, but thinking about also, how am I dressed, and did I brush my teeth before I got here, and so all that extra kind of issue. So it's an interesting to have all of those modalities, and they also kind of strengthen, because as you're working with other people on the other side and you find out, oh, they're not all crazy, then when you go on a debate and you're reading someone's Facebook post, you're less likely. And then also, if you see the best kind of tweet from like 20 people, not the most egregious tweet, which is the ones that get retweeted, but if people get together and think, oh, this is the thing we think would be most convincing to someone that doesn't agree with us, which isn't actually, there's no social media that promotes that. But if we had that, then that would take a lot less of your time and your effort to understand and maybe provide a useful counter.
Yeah. Yeah. This is what makes me think debate is a big part of the solution here, like traditional kind of classroom debate. Because, there's the tradition of switch side debating, which a lot of listeners are very familiar with. Had some controversy, not very controversial anymore, but the idea of assigning students to defend a side, whether they care about the topic or not, gets you that kind of laboratory environment where you'd say, well, I think this would be most appealing to people who would believe this. And then you can either go one of two ways. You can say, well, what's the best evidence for that? Or you can say, what assumptions are you making about that person and what they also believe that are questionable? And I think this is where we dissolve that, like both of you are saying, dissolving the wall between the other and us, and recognizing ourselves in the other. So it can go either way in debate education. I think most of the time, since debate is organized around sportified competitions or bad game design, it's like, okay, yeah, we've got them crushed. There's no response to this. This is the best evidence. And then they're shocked when the judge doesn't like the argument. And then that can be a conversation later, but normally it's about how bad the judge is at thinking. So in a lot of ways, it mirrors everyday news consumption habits and the same problems we have with epistemic security, but it could be fun as a model or a smaller model of that. But I do think if we think about it more as a classroom activity and something that complements information literacy and technological literacy, which are, I think, two of the things we've been talking about today, I think then that would be like what we would call oralcy. In the British call it oralcy or oral literacy, how to express my opinions and how to listen to the opinions of others. Might be the third part here for epistemic security.
Yeah, the having in those kind of classroom opportunities, something where you do research, beforehand, which of course you're talking about, which it's interesting. That brings up kind of a story from Society Library, Jamie Joyce, friend of the pod. She talks
I've
about,
never had her on In the Bin. I probably should.
no, yes, she definitely should.
I wonder if she
Although
would come on. I don't
she's
know.
busy now. She's been on several high profile
That's
podcasts.
true. She's been on better podcasts than this can ever hope to.
But I think she'd enjoy it.
I hope so.
But she would tell, she often is bringing people on, and her team has to dig into both sides of the debate and bring up all the points, no matter how crazy they are. Oftentimes people have, their opinions when they come to the project, and she forces them, no, you need to go in and research this, even though it seems stupid. And they come back invariably going, oh, I had no idea that there was some actual substance behind this.
Yeah. I love it when that happens.
And just the stories she relate about that, and also finding other things where someone was saying like, oh, climate change is wrong because of, is not true because of Saturn. And it's like, we got to investigate that, and they did, and it turns out there was something about how Saturn's rings formed was some scientific evidence against the belief. And I mean, they were able to debunk it, but it's amazing how there's that investigating the other side can really kind of open your eyes.
Yeah. That is super funny. Saturn's rings, climate change. This is something earlier, I think it was related to the comment too, I wanted to say, is that this idea of like in scholarly research, in professional research, there are certain research standards or standards of what would be included in an essay or not included in an essay that I think can really thwart epistemic security when that information is so readily and easily available. It's almost like the problem of the Gutenberg Bible the Catholic Church had, where it's like, no, that's not what that verse means. And you have thousands of years of scholarship looking at different languages and what that means and the place where that Bible verse was written and da-da-da-da-da. And then you have like the Protestant Revolution saying, well, no, I can access it and I can read it, and in my heart I know it's true. So it's the same thing goes for things like that Saturn stuff and everything. It's like, oh, I'm smart. I can read the scientific article and I can share it on social media and say what it means. Can you? Are you trained well enough to read that? How much of the democratization of information might need to come with stereo instructions?
Yeah, and that gets us back to also how, science communicators, there's a lot of great ones out there today, but every week you see an article about how chocolate is great for you in this way and bad for you in this other way. And they're also quoting articles that have had no peer review yet.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, maybe there should be some sort of like limit to where you don't report on something till it's been through a peer review process, and you don't report on something that it has, and then you don't just report on that. If you're saying something's good for them, you need to talk about it holistically, not just, that it has tannins in it, and the tannins are 0.00001.
Yeah.
It's like, that's, and how many times do scientists go, that's not what my article said. Not even close. It's, yeah.
Yeah, but I think teaching people to look for the facts or the best information without showing them how information is always packaged and facts are always packaged, and showing them those ways and maybe opening that up a little bit more might be a little bit better. So like one of the things that's controversial right now, critical race theory, which you hear about on the news all the time, really started as a movement of saying, look, the way the law is packaged and the way that the law is shaped publicly excludes people of traditional minority identities, and it's based on them not being a part of it at all. So what would happen if we rewrote legal articles in a way that would be accessible to almost everybody? So they're writing like narratives and things like that about the history of the law and what the politics are behind legal interpretation and stuff, which bothers a lot of people. That's why it's so controversial and why it upsets so many people, is because it shows that something that is supposed to be purely based on fact and purely based on the evidence is actually highly, highly politically motivated. And worse than that, highly politically motivated based on something like race, which everybody claims not to be a racist, right? Nobody would claim to be a racist. Even when they're making racist arguments, they'll say, no, I'm just saying the truth. Or, so that's why it really upsets people in my view. So I wonder if there's a way to kind of teach, I guess now there's a fourth thing, which is this idea of like, how are things packaged? How are things put together? And I'm thinking about the pleasure of unboxing videos Is there like an epistemic security equivalent of an unboxing video for like a New York Times story or for a Fox News story or for a scientific journal? I wonder if there's enough bandwidth out there to support that, even though this is already going to take most of your day just to read one article about Putin and determine if it's true or believable.
Well, yeah, that all gets to the attention economy, right? Cognitive limitations, and that that's the whole problem with do your own research, right? Not only is it too much time and nobody can do all the work, but also there's so many things that are so complex that you can only be an expert in one thing essentially.
Right.
If you get a PhD, you're expanding knowledge on a very tiny piece of the entire part of human knowledge, and you're qualified for that one thing, but not to break down something else, which is why we need trust, right?
Yeah.
And the canonical debate tries to eliminate that need to some degree, and all the work you have to do to analyze that article on Putin, because everything gets connected down, and at high levels you can see the average person making the argument, way down at the bottom about is this true? Putin was in a photograph with whatever person and they were negotiating whatever, and like that's somebody who's an expert or works with the State Department or whatever. Somebody whose life is studying Putin is going to be negotiating these little claims about that person, and you can trust that those experts are contributing their knowledge and hashing that out down where they're qualified at doing that, and that bubbles up to something that is more understandable at the high level. The way to fight cognitive limitations or fight attention deficit is to create the tools that do that work for us, right? In a trustworthy way. That's a problem, right? You create the tools for our epistemic processes to be more efficient, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and trustworthy in the way of showing the work, right? So they don't have to read through all the stuff, but they know they can, and maybe they have, their source, the news organizations that they like. They know they've gone through and vetted the facts in there and stuff like that. So then you get these news organizations or their proxies, having the deeper level arguments rather than just this constant ring of the top level conclusions, and no one getting down and actually discussing and documenting the reasons behind it.
Yeah. I kind of feel like sometimes the more interesting parts of these public debates get lost in that. No, it's true. It's not true. That's bad information. That's not, instead of, well, what should we believe? What's best to believe, which is the showing your work question, I would say, for the purposes of this conversation, but it could be a lot of things. Not to open up a can of worms in the last 10 minutes or so, but maybe this is a role for AI. Maybe this is a role for AI that, we have IBM's Project Debater, which is trying to show that a computer can debate. I'm not exactly sure what that is, except maybe a fun project. I don't know about the applications of that beyond being able to do it, because I think debate is one of these things that humanizes people and shows you that the bottom line buy-in on any epistemic frame is to believe that by virtue of the fact that you have a human mind, you've been given a human mind, you are worth speaking to. Like, to refuse to debate somebody is to say, well, no, you're not, I don't believe in your capacity at this very basic level. So it's quite insulting to kind of, to do that, but that's kind of where we are, I think, in terms of respect. Yeah. But I wonder if AI is the place for this, because the AI could come in and say, no, this isn't really, this is indeterminate or something. It could do it very quickly and save us a lot of times to where we could have that larger argument about what we should believe or what should be acted on.
So I think AI can do a lot to help us kind of like gather all the different opinions in a space and a lot of the kind of quoted evidence. But what we find when we start investigating, like Society Library was talking about the closing of the nuclear power plant in California, and they found that there were 9 different positions and over 4,000 different claims. But when you go and you look at those claims, at the very bottom level claims, there are assumptions in there that no one has ever stated. So that text doesn't exist, so the AIs can't learn it. So the AIs do have a kind of a limit in how far they can go, and it kind of the humans now. I mean, in another 5-10 years, AI may be able to do this, but as the way the AI is programmed right now, with learning off existing texts, just no one has actually thought this deep about both sides of the debate. So there's no way for them to extract that information, but it can still save a lot of time in the documenting and writing things down and pulling things together. And then maybe at some point in the future, once we have a good enough data set, we can try and train the AI. Um, I think
I
before we let the AI go loose on it, we need to figure out how to do it manually.
I take actually the opposite opinion or takeaway from specifically the Diablo Canyon case, which is I think AI would be fantastic for identifying very quickly the underlying assumptions, right? Because that's the kind of thing it would be good at, is breaking down all the information into claims. AI has gotten relatively good at that, and we'll get a lot better. I think in the near future, we'll be able to have AI quickly analyze and organize this sort of thing. And by doing so, you get a lot of syllogisms, a lot of logical arguments that if there are hidden premises, the AI is going to be the first one to identify that. It's going to be, well, these points don't line up logically, so there must be something missing there, right? And I think AI can really help with that. The danger of AI is exactly what we're talking about, of showing your work, right? Nobody trusts AI algorithms at this moment, and there's books written about the biases in AI. So trying to have AI think for us is an extremely dangerous proposition. There's a lot of money being put into this. There's a lot of money being put into both sides of having AI do this for us, kind of think for us, and have into how do we defend ourselves, protect ourselves from AI, which they see as essentially a what do you call it, global threat to humanity, existential threat going forward. So if you're looking for money, what you want to do is write a project about how AI is going to think for us, or how you're going to come up with a plan to protect ourselves from AI. There's a lot of money going to those things. But I think, the real way through this is a hybrid approach, right? AI is a tool, and essentially, Canonical Debate Lab, we're positioning ourselves in the world of what's called collective intelligence. And so it's an area of research and tools and thinking around how can we as a species join our intelligence together, think together, collaborate, make collective decisions, and work together more efficiently, right? And that's going to require AI, and that's going to require other tools, but we can't take the humanity out of it, or we're going to be in trouble, right?
Yeah, Terminator. I always think of Terminator when I think about the dangers of AI. Maybe that's a little overblown Hollywood entertainment there, but when it
Or the
decides to do for
Paperclip Factory, right? Terminator
yeah,
or the Paperclip Factory.
yeah, or war
The
games. If you really want to cut, war games is a good one too.
There's
Greetings,
another one.
Professor
Yeah.
Falcon. That's a good one too. Well, we're almost out of time here. We got a couple minutes left. One of the things about AI that I want to say is it's funny how much work and effort goes into this thing that I know that I can pretty much hit with equal accuracy with any undergraduate course. I can walk in and be like, okay, so there's a community in California arguing about whether or not to shut down a nuclear reactor. What do you think the arguments are going to be on both sides? And we could spend 20 or 30 minutes on that, fill up the board, and probably hit it. Probably hit most of those big. So there's something about the human mind can position yourself in a controversy you have no stake in and come up with those talking points. The question is, which are the ones that are supported with the best research? Which are the ones that are actually relevant to the people in the community and not just based on a stereotype? But filtering those two out, I think you're going to have a pretty good thing. And that's the old rhetorical practice of the commonplace, of finding those things that are the sites of where arguments tend to gravitate in the public. And we're pretty good at doing that with non-artificial intelligence, which is what I like to call myself I believe I'm a non-artificially intelligent algorithm, but there's no evidence for that. I think it would get caught on the fact checker pretty quick. But I think that's so interesting. These ancient methods of trying to identify the what they called the stasis points of public argument. Where's the controversy going to live? Most of us are pretty attuned to that. The only question is, are we going to believe the experts or not in the context? Are we going to be able to find the right information to make a good decision? Are we going to be able to overcome our pride and trust and our intense emotional confidence to reverse that decision in the future if we find that we chose the wrong information? So all these things are hot questions for me in teaching people how to argue. Because a lot of people are like, why do you teach debate? Why are you teaching the thing that's destroying the country? But I'm sure you're not on that side, guys. We're all friends here, you know.
Yeah. Well,
But
it's
it
only
goes to-
destroying the country because people aren't doing it well.
Right. It would be like it's like I always take the example from Alistair McIntyre in his book After Virtue. He says, imagine a world where you're trying to make prescription drugs and you're trying to create chemicals and fertilizer and things, but the only thing that has survived from chemistry is a torn periodic table. That's where we are in our public discussion of the virtuous and the ethical, because most of the inheritance of humanity in terms of the intellectual thought of this was destroyed, has been destroyed. Because of accidents and various ideological conflicts and things like that. But it's just like Not Tribute said. I'll put this comment up. I don't know if you guys saw this in the chat about it's kind of goes on from what is said here, but it's the idea of like, well, maybe just basic good critical thinking is what we need to teach people, because the CRT critique. I think Not Tribute. I think you are. I don't know what your gender is, but I think you're right. I think that. It's kind of obvious that the power structure is going to benefit and reflect, but that obviously doesn't mean that the law doesn't work and doesn't provide good things. But that might not be obvious to somebody who's gone down the rabbit hole on that evidence and they're like storming and defending the truth with this vehemence. So, part of the whole epistemic security thing is trying to check. I mean, I guess critical thinking just goes back to system 1, system 2 thinking, like the Daniel Kahneman stuff and thinking fast and slow. Or in the Thaler Sustein book, what's that book called? Nudge? I don't know if you guys have read these books.
Yeah.
But this is about like the problems, like there's so much good in everyday thinking that just kind of gets lost because we're just technologically illiterate. We don't understand the power of these technological things. We're isolated. All the things we talked about. We don't understand how to read. We're illiterate in terms of how data comes to us through the internet. And how overwhelmingly powerful it looks. Like even this, with the exception of this stupid bird, it's been quiet all morning. The stupid bird.
I was wondering whose bird that was.
I have a fig tree right out my window, even though I'm at a very high altitude. And it's been quiet all morning, and then the bird has come by and is announcing that there's still figs. That's what's going on there. But anyway, any final thoughts? I think we're almost done here.
Yeah, let me throw one thing out that's too big
Sure.
to get into right now. But you were talking about whether we trust the experts and that we could sit down and kind of think about the top level things. I think one of the problems is the depth of the debate. So we're not going deep enough. And I have a claim that I haven't proven that
Great, me too.
Our human brain is not actually capable of taking all the information and coming to a conclusion of many of these things. Like we're talking about the whether we should close the nuclear power plant. I don't think there might be 1 or 2 humans whose brains can actually take in those 4,000 comments and analyze all the information and come to a rational decision.
Mm-hmm.
So I think without a tool, without like at least a piece of paper and a pen, when I do my finances, I go on my bank website. I don't try and remember everything I've purchased
That's right.
in my head and try and calculate my balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like as a starting point, you say, well, I kind of need to save this much. I kind of need to do that much. And then you go to the details after that.
Yeah.
But I think
And you remember the last time you looked it up, you don't check your bank account every time you go and buy some gum, right? So there's a balance between knowing where your brain can handle the process and then when, knowing when you kind of need a tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also part of the epistemic security pedagogy, I guess, is that's kind of where I've bent this conversation, I feel like. Final thoughts, Timothy? Well, any final thoughts, Timothy? Where are you at the end of this? And maybe where should listeners go to get more?
Yeah, I
can
have a lot
put
of
the
thoughts,
website back up again, actually.
You mean which website? The article or the
Canonical.
Canonical Debate? Yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
We don't have a
can
link
check
to your
out their-
article on that, do we? We probably should.
We have the Medium, I think, and it's on our Medium page. Is it? It better be there. Anyway, we have the white paper, which describes our thinking on the solution to these problems circa like 4 years ago or something. We need to update it. We've done a lot of thinking since then. Going back to the democracy question, I just kind of want to leave you with this thought about epistemic security, which is the idea of, or just understanding how vulnerable democracy is to epistemic attacks, because the effectiveness of a society, right? Let's just say a nation, is its ability to react to changing conditions, right? React to attacks, react to things that are happening. And that essentially goes through phases of collecting information, analyzing and digesting the information, coming up with plans, choosing a plan, right? When you're leading, when you have an authoritative state, a dictatorship, or a philosopher king, that can be pretty quick, right? When you're dealing with a democracy of hundreds of millions of people, that gets pretty hard, right? Because everyone, you have to disseminate the information across the entire society. The society has to come up with positions on that thing, and then they have to hash out the positions, and eventually they have to make a decision based on that. And so, as you know, it becomes pretty clear that a democracy is a lot slower in that sort of thing, especially when it's having trouble agreeing on facts. And so, epistemic attacks, the epistemic security of a democracy, is extremely vulnerable. And there are attacks both of providing false information, but also just disrupting this process of agreeing on what is correct and agreeing on what kind of decision to take, right? So, especially for a democracy, the issue of epistemic security is extremely important. And, you know, I'll be eventually breaking down different attack vectors and that sort of thing and comparing it to the canonical debate. So, you know, if you look at that at our Medium page, at some point I'll put out another article. It took me about 2 months to write the one article that's there, so I don't know when I'll do it. But, you know, I'm happy to discuss in more depth this topic going forward. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it's like eating a nonpartisan elephant. We'll do it one bite at a time. I want to make sure that we stay neutral. Well, thank you. Thank you, Bentley. Thank you, Timothy. Canonical Debate Labs available, canonicaldebatelab.com, which I showed the website a few times during the broadcast. But that's it for this episode of In the Bin. That's it. You can watch this if you're just catching us live at the end here. You can watch this on Spotify or on YouTube or the VOD on Twitch. But Spotify, anchor.fm/In the Bin is the best place to get all of the stuff. And if you like what we're doing here, why not consider supporting In the Bin? Ko-fi.com/Tiviano and kick me a couple of bucks and maybe I can actually stream in 1080 one day. I don't know. It's kind of expensive to do this. I was surprised at how expensive it is. But yeah, if you like what we're doing, show us a little support. Until then, I'm Dr. Stiviano. Thank you to my guest from Canonical Debate, and we'll see you on the next episode, which will be next week at this time, about fallacies in union organizing with Dr. Kate Morrison. See you then. Thanks for watching.